Hi, everyone. Welcome to the CSPI podcast. I'm here with Freddie deBoer. How are you doing, Freddie?
I'm good, Richard. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. So I've liked your, I can't say I've been following you forever, but I've been following you maybe for a year or so, and I really like, I like your work. I think you're very, you're a great writer. I mean that's not, that's people. Some people have something to say. Some people are good writers, but few people are both. So I think we come at things from a different perspective, and I think your work is great. And so we're here to talk about your book, The Cult of Smart. And I like the book, and I agree with it on the main points. Basically, can you actually summarize it for the audience? I think most will be familiar, but for any who are not.
Sure. Uh, for a long time, the United States has been trying to fit a lot of square pegs into round holes by forcing everybody into the college pipeline. So,
Right.
I would chalk a lot of that up to the Reagan and Thatcherite revolution, which instituted neoliberal capitalism on a grand scale and cut the legs out from underneath occupations like manufacturing that previously had been um, places where people without college educations could reliably get at least a middle class income. You also have what many people don't realize is like the size of the government now is actually dramatically smaller than it once was. People think it's this ever growing blah blah, but it's not. Particularly the federal government, which peaked inside around like the 1940s. Um, and that's another source of stable middle class jobs that didn't always require a college education, although now they more and more do. So you have a bunch of people who used to be able to go and get stability and material comfort without a college education. For various reasons, policy reasons, those things are removed, and so now the call goes out to force everybody into college. And every president since Reagan has at one point or another insisted that college is the key to our economic future. But if you are in college atmosphere, particularly in sort of not very competitive state schools, like I have been for a long time, you can see all the cracks in that, which is that a huge number of students are coming in, taking on student loan debt, never graduating, etc. And they don't want to be there. The schools aren't equipped to remediate in the way that they need. And many of these students are simply suffering from a talent deficit in terms of like not having the human capital to be able to succeed in this way. So the whole point of the book is like, rather than trying to force everybody into that path, are there ways that we can open up more paths to people? And ultimately, if the economy is going to be something that continues to produce a sort of a caste of winners and is immensely productive in doing so, but also sort of sets aside this layer of people who appear to have no value to the current economy, do we have a moral obligation to provide for them in other ways? And it just explores what some of those other ways would be. But it starts with, and must start with, the fact that like the difference in human capital is real, right? That, in other words, that different human beings genuinely have different levels of sort of underlying intellectual or cognitive ability. And if you can't acknowledge that, you can never actually institute a humane policy, because you'll keep coming up with solutions that are like, and then we'll make the ones who aren't smart. And
Yeah.
that is the policy that has failed.
Yeah. And so there's a right wing version and a left wing version of this, right? And to you, you think they're both just denying sort of biological reality. It's strange. I mean, we don't like, everyone would see the absurdity if we tried to make everyone into like a basketball player or a football player. I mean, everyone would see that that was stupid, or we just said, everyone has to lift, has to bench press 180 pounds by the time that they're this age. And it seems like there's just, but when it comes to mental capabilities, there's just sort of no limits to the extent to which we think it's plastic, that we can just that we can expand people's ability to learn. And that's unfortunate. I mean, it really is. In your world, I gather from the book, there would be, because one of your recommendations that I like was, I think you said the dropout age should be like 12, and a lot of people would take advantage of that. I'm sure they would. And yeah, so you see, it's accurate to say your world would have less schooling, right? Because we're just forcing people to do things that they shouldn't be doing and that they have no reason to do.
Yeah, I mean, I have no way to perfectly quantify this, but I think in my ideal world, something like three-quarters of American colleges and universities would close, because I
Okay.
don't think that I don't think that there is. I mean, I think that like um, it is irrational to have the number of colleges that we have now, even for the number of students that we have now. But in my ideal world, where dramatically fewer students are feeling compelled to go to college, right? So not out of genuine desire to go. If you just remove those, then you're talking about mass collegiate closures anyway. And I will note on the dropout at 12 age, which has been a big sticking point for people. And many people say, I'm so on board. Dropping out as 12 is crazy. And the thing that I would impress on them is that you, they're already not getting an education after that age. Many of them,
Yeah.
they're just not formally allowed to drop out. Right. I mean, it's
Right.
important to say there's a huge number of students, number one, who drop out, even though the high school dropout rate has artificially been lowered over the course of decades. But there's also just a ton of kids who technically graduate, but who don't do anything. Right. Because the high school graduation rate was considered this national scandal. So much pressure was put on that metric that districts and schools found all kinds of ways to sort of just get the kids across the finish line to make their numbers look better. But what that means is that just the degree means nothing, and you have tons of kids who do just absolutely minimal learning in their high school experience and then collect the degree anyway. And so from my perspective, that's, a more honest system is to say there are kids who aren't good at this and don't want to do this and will effectively opt out of the system even if they can't drop out at 12. So you might as well allow them to do that and start to create avenues for them to be more productive with those years.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, yeah, you talk about the kids already not getting an education, not doing anything. I remember just going to junior high and high school, and already there would be kids, for eighth grade, seventh grade, freshman year of high school. They would show up, they would show up high. They would just go to sleep, and then they'd wake up at the end of the day. I mean, there were people who just did this for years and years, and I guess they were just still coming because they were gonna probably leave at 16, and it was just pointless. So yeah, those kids are already, maybe they're dropped out there, they're out of the system. Um, so yeah, I'm on board with all of that. Some of your other recommendations, though, I mean, I'm a little bit, I have more of a problem with. So the school choice one. One thing you want to do is you want to get rid of charter schools, right? And to me, I think you demolish. I think one argument that people make for charter schools is they're just going to make everyone smarter, right? You show that this is a lot of their so-called better results are selection effects and these other things. But to me, it's not about making people smarter. To me, it's about look. I hated. I went to school and I hated it. I was absolutely miserable. I was obviously intellectually capable, but I did not like the sort of the regimentation of it. I didn't like having to ask to go to the bathroom. It was just a very having to raise my hand, being told when to talk. So this was just very difficult for me. And the rest of my life has not been like that. Why? Because the rest of my life is governed by the market, and where I can, if I don't like a restaurant or I don't like a group of people or I don't like, not just markets, but it's governed by choice. So to me, school choice is just getting people out of the one size fits all sort of way of schooling. Even if we don't make people smarter or not make people smarter, that's not the point. Just I want childhood to be less miserable. What
Well,
about that argument for a kind of
Well,
charter
I
school?
do think that the argument to misery, I think, is the strongest argument if you are a parent for caring about where your kid goes to school, because there's sort of the social atmosphere and that aspect is just much more salient for your kid's life than the supposed educational advantage of one place to another. I mean, look, first, I think what we have to be clear, is the charter movement has always sold itself on a sort of on quantitative educational metrics of dubious uh, validity, to say we provide better education. We take the same students and we turn them into different. We produce better results. I've made that case at length that that's not correct, both in the book but also on my newsletter. So if we to talk about school choice, the first thing is if we're going to acknowledge that that's not really a genuine effect, then a lot of people are going to get no longer be on board in the first place. But to me, the bigger thing is compared to what you're saying is that I would be into school choice if it was a difference in anything other than administration. So I think it's important to say the experience of going to a charter school for the average kid is not that different unless the charter school is in a position where it is better resourced than the public school, in which case we're not really making the comparison we think we're making, right? To give you an example of here's the kind of school choice I think would be really cool. A friend of mine works at this facility that is connected to New Haven, Connecticut public schools. As you can probably imagine, a small, poor city, high minority, their educational metrics are quite awful in general. But they have this special facility which is on the edge of town, and it's a farm. And the kids can go there and they can do things that, yes, they have some sort of conventional educational things mixed in with them, but they go and they learn how to keep bees, or they go and they literally do farming. They learn all sorts of things about nature, et cetera, et cetera. And it's the cool thing about this program is that, like, with some restrictions, any student can opt to spend like 2 days out of every 6 weeks or something like that. And then there's students who are in a special program who can go there much more often. And a lot of kids take advantage of this. Is just like, I just can't stand another day in this building. And they just go to this cool facility out in the woods somewhere and do farming and stuff like that. Where school choice was like that, where the experience was different, then I'd be all for it. The problem is that, like, from the perspective of the student, it's very likely that many charter school students have no idea that they're in a charter school, right? And when they go out and play with other kids who go to the regular public school, the way that they discuss the classroom experience is almost identical, right? Like, sometimes people who are not sort of plugged in seem to assume that there's like very different pedagogical things going on in charter schools, but it's almost an identical curriculum usually, right? Like the pedagogy is the same. And so because it's purely an administrative change, right? Ultimately, it's always driven by a perception of who is saving money compared to what, and who is getting the money, right? And so there's a lot of really passionate advocates for charter schools, a guy like John Chait for New York Magazine, who has this incredibly romanticized view because he doesn't have to interact with, like, the actual structure of, like, whose coffers are getting filled by this, right? I mean, part of the problem is that the advocates want to speak with such zeal about charter schools that they won't admit that there's just a ton of scammy, shitty charter schools out there that are really kind of predatory institutions that are sort of soaking up money. If I felt that there was meaningful differences between these things, if they offered different learning opportunities and different learning styles for children, and if the people who, like John Chait, would get on board with sort of like, okay, let's eliminate all the corruption, right? So like, like, for example, New Orleans. People talk about New Orleans as having had this sort of charter miracle. Well, for one thing, the demographics of the city changed dramatically after Katrina. But for another thing, the most recent thing I've seen, a significant majority of the schools in the New Orleans charter system got a D on their state report card, right? So, like, miracle is a relative sort of concept, right? So, like, there has to be an entire sort of sea change in how we understand and talk about public charters before I would feel comfortable getting on board. Because the way that it functions now is it's just either, you sort of side with teacher unions and sort of the conventional state bureaucracy, or you side with another set of things, which is technically nonprofit, but where a lot of people are still getting paid, right? Mm-hmm. And that's another thing that, I hope that the people who listen to this podcast already know, which is that, like, the nonprofit distinction means essentially nothing in American life, and nonprofits are often incredibly greedy institutions. So it's just like the actually existing charter schools that we have are not things that I want to support. I can certainly imagine school choice as a sort of concept that I might endorse, but like right now, it's totally different only at the paperwork level, only at the admin level.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so what do you think about, like, I mean, but so you're for, what I'm getting is you're for sort of experimentation and just how we raise children, right? And
right. I mean, I'm for, like, look.
Does it have to be public? But I would say it doesn't have to. Can we just, like, what I would like, if I could design my ideal system, it would just be, we take whatever we're spending on schools and we just send it to parents. And maybe the charter schools today aren't that different, but you expand the market by 100, you'd have let 1,000 flowers bloom, right? I think that you would get creativity, and you would get basically people. You see a little bit of this during the pandemic. You see, like, homeschool pods, and God knows what they're doing in these, like, groups of 10 families, and it's probably better for the children. It's at the closest, the smallest possible level. That's what I would do. I think you want something so, but you'd rather government do it, I guess. But
the first thing is, like, I'm just a big lefty, and I'm opposed to, like, the concept of government expenditure as like an ATM, right? Like, I wouldn't say, like, oh, I'm never going to ride the bus, so I get to take my portion of the tax dollars out to buy a Mercedes, right? Like that's
Yeah.
not how I would function. Like I'm never going to use the cops, so I'm going to take my portion of my tax dollars out to hire private security. But the thing is like markets can only function to improve something under certain conditions, which number one is you have to have meaningful information. If you have no meaningful information, right, and most parents don't, is the problem, right? So in other words, parents are terrible judges of how smart their kid is and how much they're being educated.
Well, they can at least see if they're happy, right? If they get that call,
Well,
they
that,
can
well,
see if
that's
they're,
well, that's the thing, and I mean, like, and again, like, there are many things that I would get on board with if we understood that we are coming from the perspective of like satisfying life conditions rather
yeah,
than improving quantitative metrics, which are very stubborn and refuse to improve. I mean, the thing is like, look, like, I'm sure you've heard like a famous and very durable survey finding is Americans think American schools are bad, but they think their kid's school is good, right?
yeah,
Like they report high satisfaction with their own school and low satisfaction with other schools, which of course they have the best information about anything about their own kid's school. Um, Parents just don't know. They don't have the ability to sort of parse like what is or is not good education. And you can't blame them because now they're the professors of education.
yeah,
Okay. Like, and I think it's really important to say, like, um, we do not have to this day like a very clear set of best practices that produces the best quantitative metrics,
mhm,
right, despite armies of people working on this for decades. And the reason that we don't is because, as my book argues over and over again, the constant in any pedagogical context is the kid's brain, right?
yeah,
And teachers can't actually reach in there and muck around with it. And so the dominant variable coming out will be the kid's brain. So like even like Rand Education, which is the Rand Corporation, it's a very much a sort of conventional neoliberal school, ed reform chop shop sort of think tank. Even they say student side factors, so stuff that schools can't control, are 4 to 8 times more powerful determiners of educational metrics than school side variables, right? So if we think about this constant analogy, like, we'll just use the market. Well, okay, like, the classic sort of capitalist thing, like I make widgets, you make widgets. If I can make better widgets than you, if I can do it more profitably, more efficiently than you, my factory will flourish and yours will close. The trouble is that, like, okay, if your kid's brain is the widget, then in fact you didn't make the widget. Somebody else made the widget. You only have access to that widget 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. And then that widget goes off and it is in a completely different environment for the time that you're not at home, right? Some of the widgets are nurtured and loved and cared for. Some are battered and abused and neglected, right? And then if you say to the factory owner at the end of this thing, okay, well, he got better widgets than you do. It's
yeah,
a fair competition. I think it's fair for that person to say, well, hold on a minute, right? And so the breakdown of the market mechanism is simply the fact that, like, schools don't control that much of the variance. I mean, over and
yeah.
over again, we see random selection into different schools of different perceived quality makes no difference for student quantitative outcomes.
Yeah. Is our mistake more fundamental? So when I was, I dropped out of high school, I think when I was 16 or 17, I worked a lot of like sort of menial jobs. And it was very interesting. I worked for time at, as a waiter. I worked at like McDonald's. I knew I was really, really bad at that. Anything with hands, I was really bad at. I worked as a telemarketer. I actually sold subscriptions to the New York Times for a little while. I was actually good at that. I realized that I was good at talking and very bad at doing things with hands. And that was something I learned. I sort of knew that already, I guess. But having a few different jobs, which I realized that a lot of people who grew up with like sort of college educated higher class parents didn't really do. They never worked as telemarketers or waiters or anything like that. Maybe we should just be sending people out of the world instead of high school 4 years. What about 1 year as a telemarketer, 1 year as a welder, I don't know, whatever, as apprentice, as a carpenter, and 1 year as another thing? I mean, would that be perhaps a better system than trying to educate most people?
I think it would be a better system. I think that you would still produce some people who are good at everything and some people who are good at nothing,
Of
right?
course,
Which is
yeah,
which is a again, like a thing that I just is a conversation I have a very hard time starting in the political left. But everything, at some point you're always going to run up against uh, people have predispositions, and I do believe everyone has something to contribute and things that they are good at. The problem is not everything that they are good at is something that is currently rewarded with by the market with like a livable income, right? And this is a point that has to be stressed is people always say to me, "Oh, but intelligence is this multifaceted thing. There's different ways to be intelligent." And I say that's absolutely true, but there are still things that are more favored by the labor market, and those things are not things that we can just change on a dime, right? So, um, you know, what is perceived to be valuable changes over time. So that once upon a time, if you were in the ancient world and you were a fucking giant oaf who was good at fighting and picking things up and moving them around, you would probably have much more social status and much better ability to secure things that you want than the smartest guy in your village. Because even the smartest guy in your village was working with, like Bronze Age weapons or whatever, Bronze Age tools. Now that oaf, for once upon a time, would have been celebrated as like the warrior leader of his people. Now he is struggling as a day laborer, right, and can't pay his mortgage or whatever. And I also think that evolution can continue. So, one of the things I've been sort of predicting for a long time is that eventually, right now, if you have a certain kind of analytic mind, if you have like a what they call G, the G factor, raw cognitive processing power. Right now, it's very highly skilled, and it is highly correlated with skills in things like computer science and engineering and biomedical science and things like that are very well rewarded by the market. But you can easily imagine, right, a scenario where the way that technology evolves, that stuff actually becomes much less valuable because the computers do it all anyway, right? Like it'll probably, certainly I'll be long dead by the time this happens, but someday code is going to write all the code, right? And so if you're telling everybody learn to code now, okay, that makes sense to me. But like a couple hundred years in the future, right? I don't know that like having a high G is going to be useful when you'll never have a G that is anywhere comparable to that of the super intelligent AI. And in that scenario, maybe the soft skills become more important again, the emotional skills, the communicative skills. I don't know. But the point that I'm trying to make simply is that like, what is perceived as valuable does not have some sort of inherent like integrity or validity to it where we have to say, oh yes, this person is more valuable. I always say, look, it's not about like this person is worth more because they can be a good computer scientist in human terms, but they are worth more in the market. And so if we care about people, we have to make affordances for people who don't have those valuable skills.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. So I think one of the reasons one of the things in your book that I struggle with a little bit is the move towards, and we you talked about this a little bit, your desire to move towards away from the market system. So you take down one argument for the market system, but I don't think you dealt with the better argument for the market system. So I think that the argument you dealt with is there's people who think everything is under your choice, so the market is sort of like like a god that just distributes reward and punishment based on your worth as a human being and your effort and your moral worthiness. Okay, so that's just as a sort of a just desserts idea of the market. The other idea of the market, I think, is the Hayekian view that basically where we need to know what society needs to know what society values in the first place. You basically need the market mechanism. You need the price mechanism. Near the end of your book, you talk about, we want, I believe we can do the social, we can have a social system because look how far humanity has come, in the progress and how productive we are. And I was thinking, wait a minute, I think a lot of that progress came because of capitalism, because
Oh, for sure.
because of the market system. So how do you deal with that argument? People say, well, okay, fine, I agree with you all. I just still think the best world for the most people is still a free market system.
Yeah, I mean, you just made a Marxist argument for the record. That was, I mean, Marx's position. Marx was was fascinated with capitalism, and he felt that its productive potential was incredible. I mean, the context in which he was writing his famous works was the backdrop of Victorian London, and he was seeing what industrialization was doing. And people always point out the bad side of poverty and child labor and terrible environmental conditions, etc. But Marx was relentless in also emphasizing the positive side, which is that there's never been a productive apparatus like capitalism in history, and he was fascinated by it. And this is why he said, you cannot go from feudalism to communism the way that the Russians tried. You have to have the period of capitalism in which the productive capacity of capitalism is unleashed to the point where you can capture that productive capacity and help people who are being left behind in 1840s London, which is truly a humanitarian disaster in many ways. that's the sort of Marxist argument, right? The question is always, okay, how much is enough production, right? Like a factoid that I throw around all the time because I just think it's so illustrative is in the 1930s, one American farmer could produce enough food for 4 people to eat in a year. Okay, so he could feed 4 people for a year in a year, one farmer. Now it's more like 125, 135 people that a single farmer can feed, right? We have seen exponential growth in the ability to, for example, to feed people, or in our in manufacturing, etc. Just what we can do now is incredible compared to what we could do even less than 100 years ago. The question, I think, for people, for anyone of any political stripe, is like, at what point does that productive capacity become so incredible, right, that the argument that no one should have nothing becomes just sort of like morally obvious. If you look at like Star Trek socialism, right? I think that like there's no implied necessary period of like serious like revolution in like a Marxist, in a sort of the sort of Star Trek vision of like a future in which everybody just cared for because we can do it because we have all the stuff. Rather, it's a you can imagine a period where it's just like you look around, you're like, well, fuck, if we have a replicator, everybody should be able to eat, right? That period, when we reach the point in which we have enough productive capacity to begin to start to, and at the margins, gradually engage in a market socialism, right? So you still use the market as the pricing control system, right? We're not sort of saying, hey, Gary, you decide what everybody wants and you apportion it, but you still use the market as the way through which you apportion need. There's guys who can do a much better job than I can of describing how that works. There's a guy, Seth Ackerman, who's written really extensively about what market socialism would look like, a gradualist market socialism in which you sort of off-ramp certain goods from traditional systems and into a market socialist mechanism.
Is this a Scandinavian model where they have markets and they have the system, but they just redistribute a lot?
No, I mean, those are probably the closest real world analogs, but it's more about it's the recognition that with the exception of maybe super intelligent AI, which is another thing that I predicted, human beings are not going to be in a position of determining how badly people want things as effectively as a market does, right? So it starts from the assumption that you give the devil his due and say, one thing that capitalism is really exceptional at is having systems in place that determine the degree to which something is demanded by a particular population and to what they'll pay, right? So it's a way to sort of, these are our arguments, and they've existed for a long time. I mean, this is even like pre-Marx. People were talking about this stuff. There are systems in which there's no command economy element, right? But in which elements of the market system are integrated into a socialized system in which everyone is guaranteed a certain good, like housing, healthcare, education, while still using the market to be able to sort of fairly portion this out. And like I said, it gets super technical, and it's, people who are smarter than I am. I don't know if we're there right now. I do think, though, that we are an immensely wealthy country. We're also a country that is not taking advantage of a literally unique moment in human history. This has never happened before, which is we're in a modern advanced economy, capitalist economy, and we also are the control the world's fiat currency and have the power of the printing press, right? And nobody else has this right now. And we can do things that Ghana and Denmark and Australia can't do economically, and we should be doing more of it because we're not always going to be number one. And so as long as we're the fiat currency and our central bank is essentially setting monetary policy for the entire world in many senses, we should take better care of that. Can I say that all this will work? No, I don't know. But right now, we're producing generations of people in like Rust Belt, decaying Rust Belt cities who don't have anything to offer Google, right, or the pharmaceutical industry, or to go off to do the sort of white collar jobs that the liberal arts college grads do in big cities. And so they're living, they're dying these deaths of despair, and they're living off of phony disability claims, and they're addicted to OxyContin. And I think that like these are preventable problems. But like I said, that's just
Well, I
That's
mean,
just my view
I
of
sort of
things.
see it. Yeah, I sort of. I mean, I see how much of that is spiritual and how much of that is economic. So you talk about, we're greater productivity and people are still living, sometimes living pretty badly. I mean, there's a chart. I think it was made by AEI or maybe some other, maybe Heritage, one of these conservative think tanks, and it shows, the number of Americans who have air conditioning, for example, right? And even among the poor, right, it's like 90 something percent, and it's like color TVs, and then it's like refrigeration, and you see it like people don't have this. A lot of poor people don't have this in the 60s and 70s. But by 2010, even people we call below the poverty line, they have this stuff. So isn't sort of the providing this minimum, not perfectly, but isn't the market, the neoliberal system that you don't like, isn't it doing it to a certain extent already?
Well, I mean, look, like the fundamental moral calculus is always like, what is the calculation in terms of the percentage of people who are flourishing, who are surviving, and who are not surviving, and where do you put, if you could sort of apportion out sort of, okay, how about this many less people who are truly wealthy, but this many more people who are surviving? Now, I think a strong conservative argument from the past half century is that it's not actually easy to do that. That you can't actually just sort of wave a wand and say, okay, we're going to move a bunch of rich people to middle class, but we're also going to move a bunch of poor people to middle class. Because if it was that easy, more people would want to do it. But I also must note that Denmark has absurdly low poverty. It has the most socioeconomic equality, the lowest Gini coefficient in the world. They also have billionaires, right? Like they have people who are whose fortunes sort of are in the billions. And if you are like the richest Denmark, I think the last time I checked, he was worth like 3 or 4 or 5 billion. Your purchasing power is not materially that much different from Elon Musk's, right? Like once you get up to a
Yeah,
few billion, like it's not like you're going around saying, "Oh shit, I wish I had a few more billion, or I could buy the things I really want," right?
yeah,
But yeah, again, I mean, I think to me, it's just like all of these things run aground on these cost diseases that we don't know how to do anything with, and which seem to be an indictment of both left and right? Like I don't know who you would blame for the fact that flat screen TVs are insanely cheap, right? Cars have never been better. It's genuinely hard to find a bad car to buy now. And yet, education is getting more and more expensive, and we can show essentially no improvement in terms of the quote unquote product.
yeah.
Healthcare is getting more and more expensive with very little to show for it in terms of better outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a thing there where I don't know that anyone has a very simplistic sort of partisan message in saying like, oh yeah, we can just get rid of this hard cost disease, but we can't. I mean, I pull my hair out because so many people in my political circle complain about defunding education or something. We spend
Yeah.
extravagantly on education in this country.
Freddie. So when you write you're a Marxist. I think
Mm,
I looked forward to our conversation. I said we're going to have a lot to disagree about, and then
mm,
we talk and we don't.
yeah,
Our worldviews are not that incompatible. I think we talk about cost disease. I see you believe in markets. I see you're okay with billionaires, and I know you've written about the term Marxist and why you're attached to it. So can you
mm,
talk about that a little bit? Because I think of
yeah,
Marxist, I think of you need the central planning. To me, that's central. I haven't read nearly as much Marxist theory as you, so I know what I'm talking about. But I think in terms of central planning, and I think of forced equality. So can you
yeah.
say what Marxism means to you, and sort of the
Sure.
choice to stick with that label?
Sure. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. Like central planning is central to Marxism. I don't think that there's any point in talking about that because the Marxist revolution is not in the offing, right? But I also think it's important to say that, yes, central planning is central to the Marxist discourse. But I think it's important to say, so I mean, part of the problem is just that most people who read Marx and talk about Marx don't understand Marx. The first thing to say is Marx said very little that was sort of specific and descriptive about the post-revolutionary period, and he in fact said several times that was by design. In other words, he didn't want to be too uh, uh, to be too prescriptive because he acknowledged that he didn't know what would happen. So the fundamental thing is the core of Marxism is the notion of surplus value, the rate of exploitation, and the decline in the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. So in other words, Marx says There's this thing called the labor theory of value. It long predates Marx. Adam Smith talked about it. People have talked about it both from conservative and left perspectives economically. It's the idea that if you're trying to figure out where profit comes from, right? Because capitalism is a series of exchange. I have this pen. It costs me $1. I give it to you. I charge $1.50, whatever. Where does that profit come from? If somewhere in the system there has to be some sort of a sense of things have values that can be assigned. The Marxist answer, and the answer for other people, I think Ricardo as well, is from labor, right? And so Marx's observation is that, well, it's the workers are being paid X wage, but the capitalists are selling what they produce for more than it costs him for them to make it. Then the surplus value is being captured by the capitalist when it's being made by the worker, and that's exploitation, and that's the center of all of it, right? And in fact, Marx said his only contribution to socialism was exactly in this thing. It's a nerdy economic theory. It has nothing to do with listening to Rage Against the Machine. It has very little to do with being Cuban and wanting to overthrow Batista, right? That theory, of course, is highly criticized. Many people reject it. They said that it doesn't reflect things. It's also very much dependent upon, again, like the perspective of a guy who was looking at 19th century UK and places where people went to factories and they just literally made things. And you could say, okay, here's this widget. We produced it. The laborers only got X pounds. The capitalist sells it for Y pounds. That's exploitation. It's become much more difficult. You look at someone like me, right? I sell a newsletter. I'm my only employee. Am I a capitalist or am I a member of the proletariat? You can certainly make the argument that stuff breaks down. But at the center of that is a vision of sort of an economic theory that is Marxism. It is certainly associated with a command economy. To the degree that he defined anything, I mean, Marx's vision is sort of it is called communism, and it's decentralized, autonomous bands of people who are free to enter or exit. So you can go someplace else if you don't like your particular commune, your particular band, where everybody contributes according to what they're good at, everybody receives what they need, and where everything is led by direct democracy. Obviously, that doesn't have a lot to do with the Soviet Union or China or Vietnam or anywhere else. That's not going to happen anytime soon, right? So because it's not going to happen, I would like to remain informed by the Marxist principles that I've come up with, and I still believe them in an abstract sense. But it's like having a strong moral prescription on what we're going to do when we colonize Mars. It's still so far off that it's not useful for me in a day-to-day way of trying to navigate the world. Let's say Alpha Centauri instead of Mars, maybe. But I want to remain informed by it. The problem is like, as I said, a lot of people don't understand what communism is. I mean, I wrote in a piece not that long ago. Marxism has nothing to do with equality. Right? It's one of the fundamental misunderstandings. Like, Marxism is an engine to create equality. It's not only is it not true, it was directly refuted by both Marx and Engels independently. They both said it's a nonsensical goal because anything can be evaluated on so many different criteria that you can never sort of decide what is and is not equal. And what they wanted was an end to exploitation, right? And that's the center of it. But
So wait,
unfortunately,
do you have a theory as to why all these countries and all these people who call themselves Marxists got it so wrong? Because these people, people like Lenin and people like Stalin, they read a lot of Marx and Engels and they talked about it a lot. And you're saying that they were completely out to lunch. They totally misunderstood them. So what do you think happened there?
what happens is that, and again, I think that this is all strong fodder for a critique that says that Marxism is just it requires too much for it to ever to exist, the communist revolution to ever happen, and therefore it's not realistic. I think that's a good critique. But what happened is that, so one thing that's central to Marxism is you can't have what's called state capitalism. State capitalism is just what the Soviet Union was, which is that you still maintain a system in which you have some sort of currency exchange and in which different people are exchanging things based on a certain apportionment of value that is determined by a top-down authority. That's just capitalism under a different name, right? And it just permits sort of more sort of bad faith actors to enter into the system and to be corrupt, which is exactly what the Soviet Union was. So that's one thing. But the problem is if you get rid of that, the alternatives are so out there and they're so divorced from the current way that human setups exist that it becomes essentially impossible to put into place. So therefore, China is a state capitalist, or was a state capitalist anyway, system, and the USSR is a state capitalist system. The other thing is that you can't have socialism in one country. Right, like the revolution has to be this cascading workers' revolution that proceeds all around the world, because central to the system is I said that you have this right of exit when you were inside your particular little band, right? But if you've just sort of taken over one country, number one, you're going to be deprived of all of the things that you need to be able to live a modern life, because no one country has access to all the resources and expertise that you need. But also, you don't have that right of exit, right? If you look around and you're like, wow, Cambodia is a shit place to live. I'm in this, Marxist paradise. I want to go over to this other place. You can't do it if it's only happening in one country. So I think the reason why people have become bad Marxists is because they are confronted with the constraints of prerequisites that are so out there that they can't possibly be met in anything realistic time frame. So they begin to bend the theory in all manner of ways in a way to sort of fit what their situation is, which is what Leninism is. Right. I mean, the whole Bolshevik thing. I have a lot of respect for aspects of the Bolshevik revolution, but Lenin's writings and also Trotsky's to a large extent are sort of grappling with the fact that, okay, we can't do what we're saying we want to do. What do we do instead? And that's how you end up with people thinking that like the point is equality, because equality seems like a much more sort of achievable goal within a little bubble of a communist country that can't possibly do what Marx said they should do.
So is there you mentioned a few authors. If some people want to learn more about sort of your Marxism versus what they traditionally think of Marxism, if they're just looking at the Soviet Union or whatever, who do you recommend?
Well, I would look at, I mentioned Seth Ackerman if you want like sort of contemporary sort of theory of what market socialism would look like. There's a guy named Peter Frace, who's a really interesting guy who sort of looks at, he wrote a book, I think it's called Four Futures or something like that. And it sort of looks at the different ways in which humanity can progress from now. And it talks about the challenges of getting to the kind of situation that is advocated for by in a conventional Marxist analysis. There's also a guy called Robert Brenner, who is a Marxist professor. He wrote a book called The Economics of Global Turbulence, which I think was published in 2006, which was fortuitous because I've never read anything that more perfectly predicted the financial crisis than Economics of Global Turbulence did in 2006. But he's written extensively about like, okay, why have we never gotten to a stage where this sort of thing would be possible, and what's a more realistic sort of road through which to go through?
Okay, great. We'll put links to this. So just going back to the sort of the main focus of your book, one of the things that sort of also like took me aback by a little bit is you keep you talk about the behavioral genetics, and you talk about the twin studies, adoption studies. That's all great research. I think it's such important research. I don't think it's not even just for education. I think for everything, every field. I think you gotta take genetics seriously. But you keep introducing this qualification that says, this does not mean we have to accept racist or sexist theories of group differences. And you say it once, you say it twice, and then I'm like, okay, please not again. And then it comes again, and then you keep saying, I want to re-emphasize it again. Just put aside race because it's so. It's such a combustible and difficult issue. Like sex differences, like is it a sexist theory to believe that men and women have different qualities, and in a perfectly free system would gravitate towards different fields and interests? Is that something that it's bad for people to believe? Because I sort of got the impression that I sort of got that impression from the book.
So I think the first thing I'll say is I would have I don't believe, although people constantly think that I do. I don't believe that in the sort of race science theory that is typically accredited to Charles Murray, although I think that his own views are more complicated than people think. I would have liked to have written it written it once, excuse me, but I couldn't have gotten it published by St. Martin's if I didn't.
Okay, that's
sorry, I was a first time author, and they're one of the biggest booksellers in the world. I didn't have, So look, I will say, I would start with the thing is that, the empirical record on intellectual differences between men and women is not as strong as people seem to think. Like, there's fat tails theory. So fat tails theory is the idea that there is greater variability in men's intelligence than in women's, so that Men are more likely to be dullards than to be uh, and to be
Geniuses,
geniuses
yeah.
than women. So like you have like there's a broader range, but there's data
I
sets in
thought,
which that doesn't appear to be true.
yeah.
Some people will say that only one tail or the other is fat compared to the other thing, and it also is. I mean, I think that like the more G loaded a test is, when people say that, the more it means like the more that an IQ test is designed to test only raw cognitive processing as opposed to things that could be considered enculturated, right? Um, so, for example, there's a thing called Raven's progressive matrices. And Raven's progressive matrices, people always complain, oh, these tests are cultural. There's not even any words in a Raven's progressive matrices. It's just they show you a series, like they show you three diagrams in a row, and that'll be like it'll be a picture, and maybe like the first one there's like a black dot in the upper left corner, then upper right corner, then a lower right corner, and then you have to pick which the last one is, right, from a range of choices. So you're looking at how things are sort of spinning spatially, and you're trying to sort of predict what comes next based on the pattern established beforehand. It's as far as I understand, it's just not the case, right, that more G-loaded tests are showing higher capacity for men than tests that are less G loaded, which is what you'd expect if there was a strong sort of gender difference, and what you expect if culture was particularly meaningful. So, I mean, for me, empirically, I'm not convinced that we have the evidence that this is true simply in the quantitative sense. I do think that in many of the contexts in which this happens, culture is probably pretty strong in terms of dictating sort of like what looks like an attractive position to people. However, I will also say that there really is a pipeline problem. And it really does appear that a lot of women self-select out of these things. The trouble is that you're never going to convince people who are inclined one way or the other to decide, okay, are these sort of cultural preferences aspects of some sort of nature that are like, are evolutionarily conditioned, or, are they the product of a sort of bias? So, for example, there's about as many math majors at the undergraduate level of women who are women as men. Right, it's a little bit more men, but it's traditionally it's just about as many number of women who are going into it. However, there's dramatically fewer women graduate students. Some people will say, well, that's because men are better at math. Other people have said, well, look, if you actually look at what's happening, a far higher percentage of the women who are math majors are going to be K through 12 teachers in math, right? And this is probably a rational decision for them to make because it's a steady and stable career path in which you can do math and use your math degree to get a good middle class job. And many men face the stigma where they don't want to be K-12 teachers. Who's right? I don't know. I am not closing my mind to the possibility that
Yeah.
there are sex differences in the sort of tendency to be good at math or not. But I think that the evidence is slighter than people think. And frankly, if you look at the sort of the curve, right, if you're just looking over time, women are catching up like crazy because women are absolutely clobbering men in the classroom right now. And it's going to become a bigger and bigger deal over
Yeah,
time
well,
in
the fact
general.
that women are clobbering the men in some things and not other things, like they're doing very well in biology and not doing very well in physics. I think you have to like play around a lot to say, well, biology has overcome, millennia of structural sexism, but physics hasn't. Like, what's wrong with you physicists? Like, they must be uniquely terrible
Right.
people.
But I do have to say, like, there's a lot of math in research biology, right? Like I'm saying, like,
Yeah.
it's,
But it's
I,
not just G. It's not just G. I mean, to be a mathematician, you've got to have G. That's just one factor of many. You have to
right,
have the passion of it compared to everything else you can be doing. If women are just more interested in people and equally interested in things, they'll just gravitate towards the people centered stuff, right? So to assume that you're going to have in a fair system you'd have equal amount of mathematicians or whatever, you'd have to assume not just G is equal, but you need everything to be equal, because if they're
right, but
equal in G and they're different in ambition or work ethic or interest or whatever, then you won't get equality.
right, but I reference the emerging gender gap in education broadly because to say that, like, um, if we were not careful, if we wanted to do a particularly clumsy analysis, you could just look at that and say, well, women are smarter than men. right? If you take a look at a big broad, like
It's
not just
something,
like
it's something certainly. I mean,
right.
I think the SAT is a better measure than GPA, and I don't think women are beating men there. So you
Okay, yeah,
want to
well, I agree, but what I'm saying is just that, like, we shouldn't just say, "Oh, hey, look, there's so many more biologists than physicists among women." The simplistic story is that they're smarter in those domains because, like, again, like in many metrics, even that are tilted quantitatively, right? Like the number of women who are entering into STEM fields now outpaces the number of men simply because now again the proportions are different and that does point in the direction that you're talking about, right? But women have opened up such an overwhelming advantage of men in terms of getting to the stage of college of enrolling in college and getting to the stage where they declare a major, that now depending on whose numbers you look at, there's we're looking at like equity in many STEM fields. And so again, I think this is just to say, like, culture does matter, economics does matter, and these sort of social sciencey things are not things that we should wave our hand away and say that they don't matter.
Yeah, that's fine. I guess I was just asking about the sort of the tone in which the book talked about. But I get it's an editor's thing, and they want you just draw a bright line and not confuse anybody. So yeah,
Right.
I totally get that. Um, one so like just so that's I mean this we'll just move a little bit away from the book. I mean I'm interested in you and your sort of public persona. I was interested to learn you recommended me as a conservative
Mm.
author people read. I appreciated that a lot because we'd never talked before, and I'd appreciated
Mm.
you as sort of a left wing author. So sort of we both had like a mutual appreciation from afar. And I think one thing when I read your stuff, I see a little bit of myself in the sense that you write in a very sort of personable way. Like I read your Substack and I feel like I sort of know Freddie like
Mm.
before I knew him. I think I sort of get a little insight into sort of your fears and what made you who you are, and sort of your what's motivating you emotionally, not just sort of what you think at the intellectual level. I do a little bit of this. I don't do as much of this as you. I mean, I think you really are. You focus on that a little bit more, but I do a little bit more than that, probably more than the typical author. Do you do that consciously? Is that just something you just sort of? Is that just sort of the way you like to write? Have you thought about this in any real sense? Just whatever your thoughts are here.
I mean, my whole career has been 15 years of flying blind, so I don't, there's very little, there's been very little sort of planning going on. So on the one hand, I do think I just sort of write the way that I write because that's just, how I do it, and that's how my mind works. That's how I talk through problems. On the other hand, I keep telling people this. It's just that, like, if you want to write for a living, you are entering an extremely crowded market. And it is remarkable to me the number of people who attempt to enter that market without some sort of clear reason for why they would be chosen over anyone else, right?
Yeah.
Some people are lucky in that, like, they just really, really know certain fields. If you're an epidemiologist, the past couple of years have been really good for you. If you're a writer who's really into epidemiology, science writer, because all of a sudden there's a big market, right? I haven't got anything like that. I read a lot about education. I got a PhD in a sort of related field. I wrote a dissertation that was very education researchy, but I'm not an expert in anything. I write a lot, pathologically a lot, and I have been able to therefore develop a voice over a long period of time. And I'm selling people that voice, and I'm selling them an unusual perspective. I am someone who was a red diaper baby, and I came from, my grandfather was was the subject of a McCarthyite bill. Like him, literally, his name was in the bill in the Illinois State Senate long, long ago. And my father was a big lefty, and my mom was, and my father's middle name is Eugene for Eugene Debs. And I've been an activist my whole life. I still go out and do not at all contrarian, totally normal lefty activism. But I'm also just like deeply dissatisfied with where the left is, and especially where liberals are. I think that there's just really, really ruinous set of wrong understandings about what class is, about what socialism is, about what being on the left is. And so I have a perspective that many, many people are like hungry for someone who embraces the values of the left but hates the current left and its culture, and I happen to fit the bill. But that's all organic. I mean, I haven't like made up any of this stuff to be more marketable. It just happens that is to my advantage in this marketplace right now. And if
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
another snarky liberal who, has woke politics and tells shitty jokes on Twitter. Like, what are you selling me that I can't get anywhere else?
Yeah, yeah. The differentiation thing is important, and sort of being organic and true to yourself is important. Steven Pinker's book, the book of style. I've never read a style book before, just because of Steven Pinker, I picked it up, and he talks about when he talks to people who he admires, that with the people whose writing he admires, he often asks them, which style books have influenced you, and the vast majority of the time they'll say, I never read one in my life, and so it's sort of some people just really like to write, and they're good at it. I think Scott Alexander, who I think is also a great writer, at one point said, it's just natural. I just write, what's in my head, and I do that too. I mean, it sounds like you do that. So there is a sort of a sort of just a passion and a gift for writing. And I think a
Mhm.
lot of us who are like that sort of do see it. I see it as sort of an extension of myself, like my politics and my personality and my experience. They're all sort of intertwined, right? If my personality was fundamentally different, if my experiences were fundamentally different, if I interacted with people in a different way, my ideas about the world would also be different. And I think that not having sort of that compartmentalization, if you just sort of it's sort of it's sort of all integrated within you. I think that is sort of the key to being really good at this. Like, I think, like, when before I was writing publicly, I would talk to my friends. We would be texting, we would be calling about politics all day. All right, and
Yeah,
it's a sort of a cliche, do what you love, and most people probably can't make a living doing what they love, whatever, fantasy sports or whatever, if that happens to be
right.
your passion. If it is something you can make a living off of, then you're pretty lucky.
Yeah, I'm definitely very lucky. I also don't know that this will last. Like my whole life is a series of reversals. So like I said before, the week that Substack approached me about doing their Substack Pro program last year, I had just accepted a job to make $15 an hour at a junk removal company, and I am well aware of the fact that a year from now, I could be making $15 an hour at a junk removal company, and I'm not counting any chickens, which I think is also important in life.
Yeah, that's true. So, you talked in the book. You talked about, you spent some time at, was the University of Rhode Island. You were a PhD student, right?
So I got my master's at URI. I got my PhD at Purdue. Yeah,
Okay. And you never worked did you ever work an academic job?
I did. I worked at Brooklyn College, and then they fired me, which is cool. I mean, I got a job as an administrator, so I became extremely disillusioned with my field, with academia. I mean, I was never a romantic about academia. I grew up there. I mean, I grew up on a college campus, and so I never romanticized it. But I went to school. I kind of was told by people who I knew that in the field that I was in, which is like rhetoric and composition or writing studies, whatever, just focusing on writing. Um, there was a time when you could do quantitative research in that domain. Again, my grandfather, he was a professor, and his field was this field. At one point, he was the president of the National Council of Teachers of English, and he was hooking kids up to polygraph machines, not to do a lie detector, but to measure their stress levels in response to given literacy tasks and tests and things like that. And there was a time when you could do that, but the field was infected by cultural studies, and all of the empirical stuff got pushed out. And so I found myself in a very weird position. And so I just basically said, and to their credit, they said, okay. I went to my faculty at Purdue and I said, look, like, I got education faculty I can work with. I'm taking all these stats classes and methods classes. I'd like to just write a dissertation that's appropriate to that domain. And they didn't know what to do with me anyway. So, to their credit, they were like, sure, go for it. It's academic freedom. So I wrote a dissertation that was not really fit with my field. I was on the job market for a couple of years. I got some interviews with no bites. And then I got a job at Brooklyn College doing an administrative job that I hated and I was bad at. And they fired me. And hey, all's well that ends well. So,
It all worked out.
yeah.
Just from the inside, do you think, are you optimistic about sort of the education, sort of bureaucracy, or the academic portion of education sort of reforming itself and accepting your ideas, or is this something
Oh,
that's
no,
beyond hope?
not at all. No, 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 no. Look, like uh, the whole system. I mean, we should. I take care to say this all the time. Um, Anything having to do with competitive admissions is talking about a small set of people. I talk about the SAT all the time and how the argument against it is totally bogus, and it is. But you got to understand, like, the vast majority of colleges are not competitive in any meaningful sense, and in fact are constantly looking for more enrollment. They're actively beating the bushes for more students so they can pay the bills, including Brooklyn College, including the CUNY colleges that I was working for. But then you have the elite schools. It's less than 30% of schools reject more students than they accept for one length sort of thing. But those schools, they want students who are going to have parents who can donate now or will become wealthy donors in the future. Again, in either case, the easiest way to do that is to select for kids whose parents are already wealthy. It's not a particularly big secret within those schools. Academic rigor outside of places like Caltech and MIT and Rensselaer or whatever, those academic rigor has always been sort of a fig leaf. A school like Harvard will sort of cream off 10 or 20% of their entering class who really are like unusually academically gifted. And then the rest is made up of potential donors. That's true of their affirmative action programs. They go and they find, a kid whose Nigerian dad owns a mining company and he moved here 2 years before the kid was born. And that kid is their supposed affirmative action slot, diversity slot. They're not going into the inner cities and pulling out black kids to sort of poor black kids to hand them things. Sorry to bust anyone's illusions. The system is broken, and I think that there's going to be, the enrollments have been going down because there's a population bust, and I think sooner or later there's going to be some sort of a major shakeup. It's likely that I think that there's a very decent chance that outside of the most elite institutions, tenure will no longer exist within my lifetime. I think that that's a very likely outcome. And unfortunately, what they won't do is eliminate these immense bureaucracies that are just sucking up every dollar that you could imagine. I don't have good hopes for academia.
Yeah, but you said the tenure is going to be getting rid of. Do you think that they're going to sort of be victims of their own sort of failures? I mean, do you see the culture going in a way where, like, I think I feel like the prestige of a university degree has sort of peaked. I think that if there was a poll about you ask Republicans, like even like 5-6 years ago, they would say universities do more good than bad, right? And now that's completely switched. And I think is there a point we're getting where, look, Harvard will always be more prestigious than not going to college, but where the marginal university degree or the marginal master's degree might actually be seen as a negative, at least in certain parts of the country or in certain communities. Do you think we might get there?
Sure, that's definitely possible. I mean, one thing we should point out is so there was Briggs is a famous Supreme Court case that outlawed certain kinds of ways in which, on racial justice grounds, racial equality grounds, outlawed certain kinds of tests that employers could implement in order to let people in as employees. And part of the reason why college became such a sort of dominant mode through which white-collar work employers hired people was because it was a way to circumvent Briggs, right? I can't give my potential employee a SAT test, but the local state university can, and it just became a screening mechanism in that sense. But Briggs has been sort of whittled away by later cases for a very long time. It functionally doesn't provide much of a protection anymore. And now also with sort of digital surveillance of any candidate where, a potential employer can look online and find out tons of things about a person. It's just less salient sort of now. And so there's just less reason for them to need that sort of screening mechanism.
Yeah.
I think college is always going to exist. I think it would be far healthier if instead of, instead of setting a goal of, half the population having a college degree, which we're not close to yet, but if we set a goal for maybe a quarter, that would be a healthier system and have the degree actually mean something. I present a lot of different options for ways we could go in the book, but unfortunately, the faculty have tied their own hands because they're becoming more and more addicted to opposition to assessment for its own sake, right? Like I can't express to you how much sentiment there was when I was in grad school and when I worked in CUNY. Like grading is the hand of oppression. We shouldn't sort good or bad. Who's to say what? students can put hand in everything late as much as they want. I give everyone an A. All these things are sort of tearing down the system through which you say who is good and bad. They don't seem to understand like that is the function that society is paying for, right?
Yeah.
Higher education in this country, accounts for a few percent of GDP, right? Which is like a lot of fucking money, and we will stop paying that money if it's not fulfilling this function that the sort of capitalist system wants it to do, which is to sort good from bad and create a hierarchy and a ranking for hiring. And they think that they can get rid of that, and they'll continue to be funded just on the basis of learning is for everyone. And I think they're in for a rude awakening.
Yeah, that's crazy what you say about the education department. So I got my PhD in political science just in 2018. So I was teaching at UCLA, and it was mostly liberal and a liberal school, but there was none of this. Oh, you could hand in your paper whatever you wanted. We had grades, and we had to go easy on them, and I would just I would let things slide. But there was still at least the pretense of you have exams and you have assessment, and the question is right or wrong, and you have to turn in your paper on time. It sounds like that's not all of academia. It sounds like it's just education has gone maybe in a
Well, but
few
it's
other fields
also,
gone completely crazy.
here's the dilemma is if you don't ease up on the graduation requirements, if you don't ease up on the sort of putting all these hurdles in the way of them, then the schools are going to sort of cease to function, because the fastest growing expense in higher education is remediation, particularly in community colleges and sort of open enrollment universities, sort of low competitiveness state schools and private schools. There's just skyrocketing amounts of money being put into remediation, because you're pushing more and more kids through the high school pipeline who shouldn't actually graduate, who do, right? Because again, the policy apparatus put immense pressure on the schools and the districts. You got to get these kids graduated. So they did. Now these kids are graduating. They have no skills. They show up at college. Now the buck has been passed further down. So your dilemma is, I can spend a ton of money to remediate them, and for the record, a lot of remediation stuff doesn't work anyway. Or I can just let them through, give them the degree, put them out onto the market, and hope that the employers don't eventually realize, oh, right, this degree doesn't mean anything anymore. These kids can't do anything.
Yeah, yeah. I think, yeah. There's something there, and they're discrediting themselves. I think the cultural stuff, there's them being so clearly identified, sort of with a certain part of the country. I think that's also bad for them in the long run, and we'll see what happens. Hopefully they decline. I don't know how or if it'll happen, but I think that we share that, no matter what other difference we share, sort of disillusionment with sort of the education industry.
Yep.
So, Freddie, is there anything you want to plug, or anything you're working on that you want to talk about before I let you go?
Nope, just check out my Substack at freddie.deboer.substack.com, and pick up my book, The Cult of Smart, because it's good.
Yeah, I recommend it, and yeah, of course, Freddie Substack is great. Not just He doesn't just talk about education, but he also talks about a lot of cultural stuff we didn't get to. So yeah, it's highly recommended. Great writer too. Thanks a lot for joining us, Freddie.
Thanks a lot, Richard.